see if we can do that. How is that looking? Is it okay? Beautiful pictures by my friend and collaborator here, Joel. I take no ownership over these. These are
Well, really
uh,
by artificial intelligence, but yeah.
well, that's right. But someone had
Prompt
to
engineering by Joel Frohlich, right? Yeah.
someone had to put the prompts in. So thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be virtually present in Tokyo. We would both love to be actually present in Tokyo, but the ASSC is coming next year, so hopefully we'll be coming and joining you to take part in the ASSC. That would be wonderful. So let me turn off my phone so I'm not binged. So I'll be speaking for the first 25 minutes or so, basically just giving you a quick summary of some of the main lines of argument that Joel and I, together with Rodri Cusack, Julia Moser, and Lorena Nucci, developed in this paper that came out a few weeks ago in Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And then I'm going to pass things over to Joel, who's going to talk about some of his more recent work, including some data that's just hot off the fMRI machine. So, well, fetal meg machine, I guess, perhaps both. So, what the question that we're really interested in is this big question: when does consciousness first emerge in human development? What can we say to address that question? And that's what the TICS paper focused on, and that's what I'm going to talk about, focus on in the next 20 minutes. We're going to briefly touch on this other question, which is in some ways more tractable, which is what's the nature of the earliest forms of human experience? I mean, what can we say about what it's like to be a baby? So if the first question is, when is it like something? When is there something it's like to be a human being? When is there first something it's like to be a human being? The second question is, what is that likeness like? And of course, we know a lot about human development through the various biological sciences, and this is a really helpful slide that Joel put together. We know about neurogenesis. We know when various behavioral capacities begin, like eye opening. We know about myelination. We know about the onset of wakefulness and the precursors to various kinds of sleep. So we have a lot of knowledge of the kind that can be gained by the physiology and the routine methods of science, but none of that really engages directly with the question of when consciousness first emerges. And if you look at the literature, there's really no consensus, and the views that people have defended span quite a long period of time. So one of the papers that we discussed briefly in our review, a paper from the late 1980s, suggests that consciousness emerges before birth and at 30 to 35 weeks gestation. So that's, as it were, an early onset view of the beginnings of human consciousness. But famously, there are people, and here are a couple of psychologists, Peter Carruthers, a philosopher, has defended a similar view, who hold a very late conception of the onset of consciousness, holding that you really don't see conscious experience in human beings really before the age of 1. And that's a massive gap, obviously. Why is there this gap? Well, there's lots of reasons. One problem, I think, is that consciousness is difficult to define, to characterize, to nail down, and potentially different people are working with different conceptions of consciousness. So perhaps people who hold an early onset view are actually talking about something different from what people who have a late onset view are talking about. That's possible. So how do we try and define the thing that we're trying to study? Well, it's hard. There are some synonyms. We can talk about experience as a synonym for consciousness. We can talk about awareness. We can use this phrase that the American philosopher Thomas Nagel made famous, states that there's something it's like to be in. But none of these notions are easily operationalizable in and of themselves. So in some sense, appealing to synonyms takes us in a kind of circle. Perhaps the best way to identify what it is one's talking about is to give examples. Seeing motion, hearing a melody or beat, or hearing someone speak in the way that you might be now. Affective experience, feeling pleasure, recognizing a face. These are all ordinary examples of conscious experience. These are the kinds of things that we're interested in our work. And another way to put it is consciousness involves having a subjective perspective on the world. Again, that's not obviously something that one can operationalize in a lab or in the scanner, but it perhaps helps direct some attention on what it is that one's interested in. So how might you tell when a subjective perspective first emerges? Well, one place to look is to look to a theory of consciousness. That's a natural methodological suggestion. The problem with that, well, there's a number of problems with just directly appealing to a theory. We're going to talk about two here. One problem is that theories don't obviously tell you what to look for. So let me make that point with reference to the global workspace theory of consciousness, a very influential theory, first developed by Bayne, very influentially developed by Stan DeHaan. So according to global workspace theory, or neuronal global workspace theory, there's a global workspace that in adults is located in frontal parietal areas. You get local processing, which feeds forward into a global workspace that is able to send that information long distances and make it, distribute it to a bunch of consuming systems. So make that information available to various evaluative systems, long-term memory, various forms of attention, and various forms of motor systems. That may be a good theory of adult consciousness. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The point here is that it's not obvious how you apply it to the infant brain. It's certainly not obvious how you apply it to the fetal brain. The question is, what kind of workspace qualifies as a global workspace in the sense of a consciousness supporting global workspace? Because clearly the infant, pre-linguistic infants aren't going to have the same kind of consuming systems. They're not going to have the same evaluative systems. They don't have the same capacities for executive processing. They don't have the same capacities for long-term memory, for autobiographical memory. That's true of the infant. It's certainly true of a fetus. And so you need to stay within the constraints of your theory, and you need to give this answer in a principled way and not ad hoc. You can't just stipulate it. You need to have a principled account of what kind of workspace might support consciousness. So, here is a schematic figure here with different consuming systems, different configurations within the workspace. Each of these differs from, as it were, a neurotypical adult global workspace. And each question, and in each of these cognitive architectures, there's a question: would this qualify as a global workspace according to neuronal global workspace theory? And it's simply not clear what the answer to that question is, or how you go about answering it. So we've made this point with respect to GWT, but I would argue that parallel points can be made, perhaps not with respect to every theory of consciousness, but certainly with respect to many theories. The theories are developed based on data and from adult, often neurotypical, but certainly adult human beings, and it's not clear what the theory says about the developmental case. So that's one problem. Another problem is the obvious problem. There are lots of theories of consciousness. So on the left, there's a selection of theories of consciousness. There's a table taken from a recent paper that Anil Seth and I published. Has something like 24 theories of consciousness, some of which have lots of variants. And then on the right, there's a list of theories taken from a survey from a couple of years of the ASSC conference with people saying which theory you support. And you can see in that survey data on the right that there's no real agreement as to what the leading theory is. I mean, possibly predictive processing theory has the most support, but then some people, I myself would argue, it's not really a theory of consciousness. So, it's clear that lots of theories have lots of support, and there's no consensus, and there's no emerging consensus in the field. One reason that's important is that different theories would seem to make different predictions, make different claims about when consciousness first emerges. So here's a figure that Joel and I put in this paper. It needs to be taken with some care and some caution, I think, in large part because of the first point I made, that it's not always clear what a theory implies. Another point is that these theories are in some sense families of theories. So this is particularly true of the higher order representation theory, which is not so much a particular theory. It's described that way, but I would argue it's really a family of theories. And different versions of that higher order representation approach will have very different implications for when consciousness emerges. I mean, some of them might place the emergence of consciousness at birth or near birth, but of course, other higher order thought theorists place the emergence of consciousness based on their version of higher order thought theory at the age of 1 or even closer to the age of 3. So the D. Nash and Perna paper I mentioned earlier, where they argue for that consciousness is not in place until about the age of 1, in part they're appealing to a higher order representation theory. And Peter Carruthers has defended a view, again, based on a version of higher order representation theory, that put a lot of leeway, there's a lot of flexibility within a theory as to where you might place the emergence of consciousness. But still, even given those considerations, you can see that your choice of which theory to adopt is going to have implications for what you say about when consciousness emerges. So with that in mind, we sort of set appeals or direct appeals to theory to one side, and instead adopt what we call a cluster-based approach. In other work with the British philosopher Nicholas Shea, I've talked about this as a natural kind approach, and what we do is we take various indicators or markers of consciousness in adults, particularly using markers and indicators that have been used in the disorders of consciousness world, and trying to ask when they first appear in development. You would be foolish to draw definitive conclusions from any single marker, but that's not the point. The aim is to try to make reasonable claims based on convergent evidence from multiple indicators. And another point that we make in the paper is we really focus on neural and functional markers. We do appeal to some behavioral based markers, but one of the things about behavior and in development is I think there's an increasing sense that infants have a lot more going on cognitively than they're often able to manifest in behavior. So if you focus too heavily on behavior, there's a sense that you'll underestimate the sophistication of babies, and that's certainly one of the lessons I think from many decades of work on theory of mind. So here's some of the technologies that the studies we draw on are using. There's infant talk about that. There's infant FNIRS, which is less well used, but is also being used in some studies, and increasingly infant fMRI with awake babies. There's a few labs doing that, despite the obvious challenges. So what I'm going to do just in the next 10, 15 minutes or so before I hand things over to Joel is just briefly talk about some of the lines of evidence that we take to support an early onset view of consciousness. And we don't really say what early onset exactly is. Some of these lines of evidence point to some form of consciousness perhaps being in place before birth. Others are really at 3, 4, 5 months of age. But certainly the bulk of evidence, in our view, points to consciousness being in place well before the child's first birthday. So one form of evidence that we discuss is drawn from looking at connectivity networks, and the real key paper that we draw on here is first author of Ho-Kwang Hu from Trinity with Roger Cusack and Narina Nachi, and they had a large sample of infants, including preterm neonates, both looking at imaging them both at term equivalent age and before term equivalent age, and just comparing them for connectivity, looking at connectivity with comparing that to connectivity in these crucial networks in adults. And why these networks? Because these networks have often been implicated in the recovery of consciousness following coma. So transitioning from the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, or what used to be called the vegetative state, into the minimally conscious state. And whereas earlier studies had shown that these networks, particularly the default mode network, weren't particularly well developed at birth, what this study found is that they were well developed, and importantly, and it's really this bottom panel that's most important, the reciprocal relationship between the default mode network and some of these executive networks, particularly the dorsal attentional network, was in place. And that's what's particularly striking about this large study. So, large N's, high-powered study, and showing that some of these crucial, frontal networks are in place and talking to each other. I think that's the other key takeaway from that work. The second line of evidence that we think points towards an early onset for consciousness involves attention. Now, of course, the relationship between attention and consciousness is contested. It's been a topic of debate in consciousness studies for 20, 30, 40 years. So some people, here's a quote from a review paper by Philippe de Brugade and Jesse Prince. Some people say attention is necessary and sufficient for perceptual consciousness. That's one view. Another view, which is probably more influential, especially within neuroscience, I would say, articulated in this influential paper by Christoph Koch and Nao Suchiya, is that consciousness and attention, often go together, but they can dissociate. You can get attention in the absence of conscious perception. We see that in blind sight. Bob Kentridge has done a lot of influential work there. And many people would argue you can get some kind of conscious perception in the absence of attention. And that's actually what Nao did in his postdoc with Christoph Koch, and was quite influential in some work there. I mean, all of this is extremely controversial, obviously, but one thing which does seem fairly clear is that ordinarily attention and consciousness go close together. And we think that's enough to use what we know about the emergence of attention as an indicator or a mark of consciousness. Even if the two phenomena can dissociate, you often have to work very hard with your psychophysics, with your perceptual, phenomena, or you have to have some kind of lesion in V1. You've got to have blind sight to pull them apart. It takes a bit of work to pull them apart. They normally go together. And that's enough, we think, to use what we know about the emergence of attention to constrain or inform what one says about the emergence of consciousness. So we really tell the story in two parts. The first part focuses on top down, what some people call endogenous or voluntary or goal-directed attention. That seems particularly closely linked to consciousness. And that seems to emerge, and here we're drawing some older work, at about 3 to 6 months of age. More controversially, you might appeal to bottom-up stimulus-driven attention, the kind of attention that might guide eye movements independent of goals, independent of the agent's task. That's present fairly soon after birth. We know that. Whether that indicates consciousness is a little bit more unclear. Some would argue that those representations, that kind of attention that's guiding eye movements, is driven by unconscious representations. We point to some very interesting work that's very recent by first author was Cameron Ellis, working with out of Nick Turk-Brown's lab at Yale, showing that even for that kind of stimulus-driven attention, before the age of 1, there's evidence of frontal involvement in that. And so that's a kind of that supports, I would argue, the thought that that kind of attention, at least before the age of 1, involves consciousness. Now, that study wasn't there weren't enough participants in that study. They didn't really stratify them by age. They just as long as they were under 1, they used them. So there's not enough data there to know whether that frontal involvement is in place at the age 3 months of age or 6 months of age or when it first comes online. But we still think it's interesting and suggestive that there might even be a case for that bottom-up stimulus-driven attention, which is guiding the infant's eye movements to highly salient stimuli, to think of that as an indicator of perceptual awareness. A third line of evidence that we talk about involves multisensory integration. Now, here again, there's controversy as to the degree to which multisensory integration involves consciousness. So a nice review paper about 10 years ago, I think, written by Liad Mudrik when she was a postdoc with Christoph Koch, pointed out that there's lots of multisensory integration outside of consciousness, outside of awareness. But what they argued, and this paper in Cognition by Palmer and Ramsey also argued, is that some forms of multisensory integration seem to require consciousness, as far as we can tell, in adults, that is, and in particular the McGurk effect. So I imagine this is familiar to many, but let me run over the basic form of the McGurk effect. Again, when you splice audio of someone saying "ba" onto visual representation of someone mouthing the phoneme "ga," phonemes "ga-ga," what the perceptual system does is it basically splits the difference between the auditory information that's coming in and the visual information, does a bit of Bayesian updating and says, okay, well, vision's wrong, audition's wrong. I'll split the difference. My posteriors will generate the phoneme da. And not everyone hears that, but it's a pretty reliable effect. And it seems as though, from what we can tell, in order to get that McGurk effect, though the input has to be conscious. You don't get it when it's subliminal or, for example, presented within the neglected field of unilateral neglect or something like that. So that suggests that we might look at when the McGurk effect emerges in infants as some sort of guide to the emergence of perceptual awareness, mind for this kind of thought, suggesting that McGurk-like effects can be found at about 5 months of age, and another paper which sort of a quasi-reproduction found intermittent McGurk-like effects at 4 months of age. So again, this is not at birth, but significantly earlier than 1 year of age. And as much as anything, we're trying to make the point of how we're trying to make a methodological point as much as a first order point about what the data shows. We're trying to show how you might go about addressing the question of infant consciousness. It's not definitive. You might argue, well, consciousness is required for McGurk like effects in adults, perhaps because you've got canalization of, and you really need consciousness to sort of overcome that segmentation. Infants don't have that segmentation. Maybe everything is kind of multi-sensory uh, in the infants. You don't really have separate perceptual streams, and that's why you get McGurk effects early. Those arguments could be made, but we take it to be at least indicative of perceptual awareness that you get a McGurk effect. The final effect, the final marker that we look like is the P300 or P3B, as it's sometimes called, global effect. And again, we're drawing on methods that have been developed with reference to patients suffering from post-comatose disorders of the vegetative state or unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. So this is work that Tristan Beckenstein and others developed back in 2009. So, it turns out that when you give patients a global oddball, so the local oddball is the red stimulus, which is either a low tone or a high tone. And that's a local oddball because it's an outlier with respect to that set. So if you look at the first set, you get three, let's imagine they're high tones, four high tones, and then you get a low tone. Next set, four high tones and then a low tone, four high tones and a low tone, four high tones and a low tone. You would expect, once you've set up, once you've done a bit of perceptual learning, you'd expect that the last tone in the next set, the final set, is going to be an oddball. But if you go down, you get a local, the local standard, so the final tone is the same as the preceding four. Relative to that set, that final tone is not an oddball, but it is an oddball in the context of that whole stimulus presentation, of that whole sequence of sets. So that's what gets called a global oddball or a second order oddball. So a case of hierarchical learning. And it turns out that the evidence seems to suggest that you need consciousness for there to be a neural response, typically 300 milliseconds post stimulus presentation. What's the P300 or P3B? You need consciousness to get that neural response to the odd global oddball. And this technique's been used in the disorders of consciousness field as a kind of treated as a kind of marker of consciousness. You don't need consciousness for the local oddball, the local deviant, but it looks like you might need it for the global oddball. So with that in mind, what Julia Moser at Tübingen did a couple of years back is looked for neural responses to the global oddballs, the global deviants in infants, and she had and she found that there was a fairly reliable response. Now, it wasn't a P300 because it wasn't at 300 milliseconds post stimulus presentation. If you like, it's a P600. It's around about 600 milliseconds. But in a sense, that's what you'd expect, because in the neonatal brain and the infant brain, everything's a whole lot slower. Interestingly, the effect was there for infants showing high heart rate variability, which is a kind of a proxy for wakefulness, or and when you have low heart rate variability, sort of a proxy for a kind of sleep state, the effect wasn't there. More interestingly, in a way, or equally interestingly, but interesting in a different dimension, Julia also found a P300, or if you like, a P600 response to global oddballs in fetuses, in late term fetuses. Again, when they were in the state of high heart rate variability, a kind of state of wakefulness, and not really there in low heart rate variability. Not not early term fetuses, not midterm fetuses, but I think the effect was really at 38, 39 weeks, if I remember rightly, Joel. Certainly somewhere in the 35 to 40 week interval. So just to summarize, this is a beautiful graphic that we put together, which helpfully sums some of these indicators. You've got the emergence of these connectivity networks, which seem to be implicated in consciousness from what we know about the recovery of consciousness after coma, which is sort of pretty much present from birth and in some sense present and functioning in late gestation. Depending on your take on attention, it's there certainly well before the age of 1 and arguably then not so long after birth. Multisensory integration looks like consciousness implicating multisensory integration might be there from 4 to 5 months of age, possibly earlier, we don't know. And we get these P300 like neural markers of responding to these global oddballs, picking up on a prediction error as a result of perceptual learning from 35, 36, 37 weeks of gestation. That work hasn't been replicated, but it's still suggestive. So just before I finish and hand things over to Joel, where does this leave us? Well, we're not defending the claim that consciousness is definitely there at 30 weeks gestation or even 35 weeks gestation, but we certainly think consciousness is in place a lot earlier than the late onset view defended by, for example, Perner and Dinesh. What is it like to be an infant? There's a lot one can say here. One can look at differences in the maturation of audition as opposed to vision. One can look at what we know about when color perception comes online. Maybe normal adult perception of the Grand Canyon's a bit like the one at the top, and the infant experience is a bit like the one at the bottom. There's interesting work on the duration of the attentional blink, which is very much longer than it is in adults. We can ask about subjectivity. What might the experience of the self be like for the infant? In what way do they experience their body? So all of these questions are open, and as much as anything, we're just trying to not so much start a literature on these, because of course people have been working on these issues for decades, but trying to bring them more into the mainstream of consciousness science. So with that, I'll hand things over to Joel and stop sharing, I guess.
All right, cool. Thank you, Tim. So let me pull up the slides here and start from the beginning. There we go. All righty. So Tim just covered our recent paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, which is, of course, a review. And we also had another review paper earlier this year in Neuroimage, which is kind of talking about how we can apply some neural markers, specifically perturbational complexity, to the perinatal period and try our best to infer when consciousness might begin. So I'm going to go over that and also a recent preprint, which actually applies neural complexity measures to fetuses and newborns. So yeah, these are current and near-term applications of the ideas we've been talking about. And first, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about hardware. So, we briefly mentioned techniques for recording neural signals in fetuses and infants. Most of them are ones you're familiar with. I'm sure you've all heard of MEG, but fetal MEG specifically is slightly more obscure. So I just thought it would be worth going over this briefly. So there are two dedicated fetal MEG devices in the world. One is here where I am in Tübingen in Germany, and the other is in Little Rock, Arkansas in the United States. And they're similar to conventional adult MEG, but the SQUID sensor array of magnetometers is this concave shield that is complementary to the maternal abdomen. So that's what you see in A, and you also see a zoomed out view looking from outside the magnetically shielded room on the left-hand side of the screen here. So these squids are positioned so that they can pick up fetal biomagnetic signals. Of course, they also happen to pick up a lot of other things like the maternal heart is actually the strongest signal they pick up, and also the fetal heart, of course. But this is a really cool technology that allows us to non-invasively record brain activity from fetuses. We can also present sensory stimuli this way. So what you see in panel A, you notice this greenish blue object between the maternal abdomen and the sensor array. So that's a sound balloon, which is basically like a speaker that doesn't create magnetic interference. So we can play auditory tones during the experiment, similar to, well, actually, specifically, we can play the local global oddball paradigm that Tim introduced. It's also possible to even present visual stimuli to the fetus. So, you know, red light will pass through the tissue of the maternal abdomen. You can just put you know, some red LEDs there and flash some lights and get visual evoked responses from the fetus as well. A nice thing about this device, you can also record from infants and newborns. So it's not strictly just fetal. So in panel C here, you see an infant. The cradle is positioned toward the sensor array. The infant is resting on its side, sleeping, as it generally needs to be in order to record data. And, you know, there's this cute little infant-friendly headphone that the infant is wearing. And so you can also present the auditory stimuli that way. And so you can actually do experiments longitudinally. You know, you can record from the same subjects before and after birth, you know, just have them come back into the lab as newborns and record from them again. Finally, in D, you see what fetal MEG might look like with this newer technology, optically pumped magnetometers, or OPMs. So if you haven't heard of OPMs, these don't require a cryogenic coolant. So, you know, conventional MEG is done with squids, which require liquid helium. They have to operate close to absolute zero. The OPMs do not. They can operate at room temperature, no cryogenic coolant, which means very flexible placements. You can just have sort of like an ad hoc sensor array with some 3D printed parts to hold the sensors in place. So that's going to really help with reproducibility in this field. At the moment, there's not a lot of sites that can record fetal MEG. So this is a map of probably not all MEG sites in the world, but at least the ones that are listed on Biomag Central. Obviously, most MEG sites are dedicated to adult MEG. That's what you see in cyan. That's most MEG sites, of course. And then you have a few that are dedicated to infant MEG, what you see in yellow. And a very tiny number can record fetal MEG signals. And of those, not all of them are even still used today. So in purple, you see a couple sites that used to be in operation, but it seems they no longer are. And in red, you see the two remaining dedicated fetal MEG sites. Again, one where I am, GB in Germany, and another in Little Rock, Arkansas in the United States. So you might be thinking, hey, if there's only two sites, how are they going to replicate each other's findings? I mean, it's going to be a little tricky if there's only two of them. And then furthermore, if you want to really use this, how are you going to translate it into the clinic? So that's where optically pumped magnetometers come into place. So again, no cryogenic coolant, can be applied in a very flexible manner. Let's just compare what this looks like versus conventional fetal MEG. So panel A1 on the left here, this is what it looks like right now if we record fetal MEG here in Tübingen. The woman has to kneel in front of this fixed sensor array. But then in B1, you see what this looks like of OPMs. You can just apply them to this 3D printed belt, right? You could actually move the sensors based on where you know the fetal head is, based on, say, an ultrasound you do before the recording. And furthermore, you know, that reclined back posture is likely quite a bit more comfortable than having to kneel in front of the sensor array for a long time. Now, in both cases, you get a mixture of, again, fetal brain signals, fetal heart signals, maternal heart signals. So, you know, granted, they're noisy data in either case. You have to do quite a bit of pre-processing to extract the fetal brain signal. But at any rate, we do think that OPMs are going to really expand the number of labs that can collect this data. And in fact, these devices are getting smaller and smaller. So over on the right, you can see what the third generation Q-spin OPMs look like. So right now they're, you know, smaller than your thumb. And again, you just 3D print a belt like what you see in panel D here, pop those little sensors in, then in E, you can get an elastic band, hold that belt in place, and boom, you've got an ad hoc recording setup with OPMs. So you might be thinking, okay, that's great, cool hardware, but what are you going to do with these data? How are we going to really infer perinatal consciousness with these data? So as Tim mentioned, a lot of neural markers that we know work reasonably well in adult disorders of consciousness, for instance, and maybe we can translate them into the perinatal period. So one that I'm particularly enthusiastic about is the perturbational complexity index, or PCI, which I'm sure you've probably already heard of. So that's, of course, taking TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, giving a little pulse of electromagnetic energy, and just looking at how the cortex responds to this pulse, and specifically looking at the complexity of that cortical response using EEG. So you can't exactly do that in fetuses and newborns. I mean, for one, there's huge ethical issues with giving electromagnetic stimulation to fetuses. A lot of people are hesitant to even do TMS to the brain of a pregnant woman, okay, much less the fetal brain, right? We just don't know what the long-term effects of that stimulation would be so early in development. So we have to get a little creative to get around that. So I'm going to go into some workarounds in a moment. But first, I just want to really make sure we're all on the same page regarding what PCI actually is. So this was developed 10 years ago by Casali et al., this Science Translational Medicine paper. And the idea is that when you give this pulse of energy, you want to see a rich and varied response across all cortical sites you're recording from. So that's what you would see in the top row of this figure here. And that's what would correspond to a high level of consciousness during, just normal wakefulness. If you just see a very localized response, that suggests you have a lack of integration, and therefore you're in a lower state of consciousness, maybe dreamless sleep, anesthesia, so forth. So that's what you see in the middle row. And similarly, if you just see this monolithic response, every cortical site responds the same way, well, then you have a loss of information, and you're also likely to be in one of these lower levels of consciousness like dreamless sleep, anesthesia, and so forth. Okay, so that's the PCI in a nutshell. And, just to be really clear about what I mean by complexity, because that can be a confusing topic. By complexity, I essentially mean entropy, which is the number of possible states of the signal. Of course, entropy is a concept that goes back to thermodynamics, where it's the number of possible ways in which a system can be rearranged, right? And in a very colloquial sense, it roughly corresponds to the disorder of a system. Yeah, so higher disorder, higher entropy in general. And we can actually quantify this mathematically in terms of how difficult the data are to compress. So the Limpel-Ziv compression algorithm, this is a classic compression algorithm, and you can apply that to a neural signal, like what you see in this figure from Timmerman et al. So this black trace would be an EEG signal. You could binarize it either using the mean value of the signal itself or its wave envelope, which is shown here in green. So the red, of course, is the mean of the wave envelope. And you just count, okay, is the signal above or below this threshold? And you get this binary string of ones and zeros. And then you apply some pseudocode to build a dictionary of substrings within the signal. And so a large dictionary means you have a complex signal, and a smaller dictionary means you have a less complex signal. And intuitively, I think compressibility maps onto our intuitions about complexity. So just imagine you had two JPEG images saved on your computer. Maybe one is a Rothko painting, which is very simple aesthetic, lots of redundancy, and it would be easier to compress, smaller file size. Then you have a JPEG of a Vermeer painting. There's more complexity, there's more happening in the painting, there's less redundancy, and so you would probably have a larger JPEG file size. Okay, now it's worth noting that even spontaneous complexity, that is, not the perturbational complexity, but just the complexity you record from EEG when there's nothing in particular going on, even that relates quite strongly to the level of consciousness. So there's a Sarasso et al. 2021 review in Neuroscience of Consciousness that lists over 100 papers that have related entropy or complexity to the level of consciousness. And, they're not, most of them, in fact, I don't think are looking at perturbational complexity, rather they're looking at spontaneous complexity. So bringing this back to infants and fetuses, right? How are we going to do this? especially if we want to look at the perturbational complexity in particular. How are we going to do this without TMS? Well, it turns out you could use some sort of sensory stimulation to perturb the cortex in place of electromagnetic stimulation. In particular, if we do something like the local global oddball paradigm that Tim introduced, where we have some deviant tones, it would seem reasonable to assume there's going to be some prediction errors, and that's going to perturb the cortex even more strongly than if we just have a train of repetitive stimuli that are likely to induce habituation, right? So we would give these sensory perturbations to the infant, the fetus, etc. And then we look at the spatial temporal pattern of either EG or MEG signals we record in response. And like I say, we compress that and we look at the complexity and we sort of infer, okay, it's a state of high complexity, high consciousness, low complexity, low consciousness, right? So that's the idea. We outlined it in this neuroimage paper we had earlier this year. So take a look at that if you're interested. And there have been, before I go into the perturbational stuff, I just want to say there have been papers looking at spontaneous complexity in infants, in particular preterm infants. So this is something that has been done before. So in particular, Eisler et al. Had this PLOS1 paper in 2018, and they looked at preterm infants. And in particular, they actually looked at an estimate or a proxy measure of integrate information, which is the autoregressive integrate information. So of course, that's very directly inspired by IIT. And they find some nice things like, hey, this measure seems to correspond to different sleep states, and it seems to increase maturation. There's a positive correlation between the gestational age and the autoregressive integrate information. The caveat is, with this particular measure, it's very sensitive to this lag parameter, tau. And so if you change the lag, you get really different results, right? You might not even get any correlation at all. So that's one shortcoming of the approach they took. Then there was this Deville et al. Paper published in Entropy, which also looked at the complexity of spontaneous EEG in preterm infants. So this in particular was the multi-scale entropy, essentially just looking at the predictability of the signal at different time scales. And I think the results here map nicely onto what most of our intuitions would be. So for starters, they find there's higher complexity during active sleep, which is analogous to REM in adults when we're likely to be dreaming. And there's lower complexity during quiet sleep, which is analogous to NREM sleep in adults. Now, I say analogous because sleep architecture is immature at this point in development. So, it's not a perfect mapping onto adult sleep architecture, but at any rate, that seems to be about what we would expect. And furthermore, there's a positive correlation between maturation and complexity. So you can see in this figure here on the left, younger infants, lower complexity, higher infants, higher complexity, or older infants, higher complexity. And, that makes sense. You would think as the infant matures, the capacity for consciousness might increase, right? So now let's actually look at the perturbational case. So this is work that I've been doing with the Fetal MEG Center here in Tübingen. So specifically, we did this with the local global paradigm that Tim introduced. So again, we have auditory deviance within a sequence, and you can have deviance both within and between trials, okay? So important thing is that you're not simply inducing habituation, you have some oddballs thrown in there. And this is 101 MEG recordings from 43 fetal subjects. So obviously we had longitudinal data. We recorded from some of these fetuses more than once. And the gestational age range was anything from 25 weeks gestation all the way to birth, and then even after birth in the case of about a third of the subjects who came back into the lab as newborns. So we took about 3 seconds of data as our epoch, and that included all 4 of the stimuli in the auditory sequence, and then a full second of data following the last auditory stimulus in the sequence. So it's really important to stress that even though this is, kind of inspired by the sensory PCI approach, strictly speaking, it's not the sensory PCI. For one, we don't actually apply one of the PCI algorithms, but more importantly, there's no spatial dimension to the data. Now you might be confused and thinking, wait, I thought your MEG array had lots of channels, and that's true, it does. But the thing is, we have to spatially average across the small number of channels that record fetal cortical signals. The reason being is that the fetal head, you cannot control the orientation, right? It's going to be oriented differently in each recording. And so, a particular channel in one recording isn't going to be picking up the same kind of signal as the same channel in a different recording. So just pragmatically, you have to average across those channels, all right? So again, no spatial dimension to this, so really not PCI, but it is sensory evoked entropy. So we had this naive hypothesis where we thought, okay, we look at the younger fetuses, they're going to have lower entropy corresponding to a lower capacity for consciousness. We look at the older ones, the entropy is going to get a little higher. And then we look after birth and it's going to be higher still, right? It seems to make sense, but we were actually completely wrong. So we were quite surprised by this in the beginning. And we actually found that in the male fetuses, you have a decrease in entropy with gestational age, all right? So, this is quite surprising to me and most of us, I think. And we actually apply 6 different entropy algorithms, okay? So we look at different ways of measuring complexity to make sure it's not particular to any one algorithm. For all of these 6 algorithms, and I won't go into the nuts and bolts of each of them because that would take a while, but for each of these algorithms, we really find the same pattern that in the male fetuses, something like roughly half of the variance in entropy is explained by the gestational age, again, decreasing with gestational age. Whereas in the female fetuses, it's never more than 5% of the variance explained by gestational age, okay? So obviously, this is now looking like we're just capturing an effect which it may be interesting in its own right, but it doesn't really seem to have anything to do with consciousness. If we look at the data from newborns, there's a much smaller sample size. So, we're underpowered to show the sex effect, but it for sure is decreasing with gestational age and the newborns as well. So this is actually, as surprising as it is actually consistent with at least one prior study. This was the other fetal MEG site in Arkansas in the US. This was a study done a few years ago looking at auditory and visual evoked responses in fetuses. And they found, at least for the visual evoked responses, that it's significantly harder to detect the responses in males as opposed to female fetuses. That actually fits fairly well with what we found because, if the females have different complexity than the males, it's going to be harder or easier to actually see this auditory evoked response. The idea being that complexity masks that response, right? So when you have lower complexity, that auditory evoked signal that you see in orange at the top just pops out more nicely. Okay. As far as why we actually see the complexity decreasing with gestational age at all, one explanation for this is that, very early in development, there's a large number of possible circuit configurations, which is what you see on the left in panel B. And then as development progresses, you have synaptic pruning, you have apoptosis, and there's this idea of canalization, that genetics is kind of pushing everything toward a narrow trajectory. And you come out the other side of that trajectory, and there's one more or less canonical circuit configuration that everything settles onto. And so by definition, that's lower entropy because there's just fewer ways to configure that system that you end with than what you started with, okay? So that might be why it declines with maturation, but of course that's not really having anything to do with consciousness. Now, some of you might be thinking of Robin Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis here. So the entropic brain hypothesis says roughly that the entropy of spontaneous brain activity scales with the richness of conscious experience, but only up until a certain point. So when you actually get high enough entropy, you move beyond a certain critical point, which is optimal for information processing, and you get into this regime of just noise where it's no longer useful, okay? So, you could ask, oh, maybe the fetuses are just starting from way above that critical point and development sort of lowers them down to the sweet spot, which is an interesting idea, but there's 3 problems with it. The first one is that, at least the way Robin Carhart Harris has articulated this idea, it's really focused on spontaneous brain activity, and we looked at sensory evoked activity, of course. Furthermore, there's no reason to expect that it would interact with sex if this were really about consciousness. And then thirdly, we even classified the neural dynamics of these signals to test this theory a little bit. So there's this decision tree algorithm that my former lab mate from UCLA, Daniel Toker, published on a few years ago, where you can classify any time series as being stochastic, so intrinsically random, or deterministic. And we found that at least within the fetuses and within the newborns, you don't really see a tendency of the dynamics to change with maturation. If you were to actually compare between the two groups, it's the fetuses who show more deterministic signals and the newborns that show more stochastic signals. Whereas, the entropic brain hypothesis would really predict the other, that you see more stochastic signals, more intrinsically random signals in the beginning. And then as entropy declines, maybe it becomes more deterministic. So in short, it's an interesting idea to try to apply here, but it doesn't really seem to fit with our data. So at least the story so far with the data I've been showing you is that it's very difficult to relate the sensory evoked entropy to consciousness in fetuses. But remember, there's no spatial dimension to these data I'm showing. So at any rate, just to wrap this up with some conclusions, obviously, infant consciousness is a hard problem. Infants can't talk. Infants can't follow commands, which isn't to say that there's no behavioral data that's useful. Like attentional data could be useful, but we're going to have to rely very heavily on neural markers like fMRI, EEG, MEG, and translate them from, where they seem to indicate consciousness in adults, and then hope that that also applies in infants or maybe even fetuses. And there does seem to already be some convergent evidence pointing toward an earlier emergence of consciousness rather than a later emergence, although we're not comfortable yet saying exactly when that early emergence is. And we're very interested in applying particularly these neural markers based on complexity and perturbational complexity to infants or fetuses, but there's a lot of challenges that remain. So with the papers that have been published on spontaneous entropy, the results seem to, match more or less with our intuitions. But when we look at sensory evoked entropy, the results are a bit puzzling, and it's a lot harder to interpret. So thank you for hopefully remaining conscious throughout this presentation. I hope that nobody's fallen asleep yet. And with that, I'll go ahead and take questions now.
Okay, thank you for the great talk, guys. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so we have a short break, 5 minutes. So the restart from the 6-9 in Japanese time. Okay. So yeah, we can meet again, but unfortunately, the team leave to the Q&A session, but the Joyce can attend the Q&A session. So yeah.
I think I can stay, Kazuo.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yeah. Well, I might be called away by a crying baby, but
Okay.
I think I can stay for now. Thanks.
Okay, so we will restart the 8-9. So
Okay.
yeah, thank you for the attention. So we can have a break.